everyone, and welcome to Gravely Amusing, the only horror history podcast that is willing to believe the earth is hollow before I'm willing to believe that the earth is flat. I am your host, the horror historian, Bryan Peters. Thank you so much for joining me. If you've been following this season of Gravely Amusing, you know we've been focused on the 1950s and the birth of sci-fi and kaijus and monsters and everything awesome. Well, today we are continuing the 70th anniversary of the King of Monsters, Godzilla. And with a new movie coming out soon, Godzilla X Kong, the new empire, we're also celebrating King Kong, and we even celebrate Ghostbusters 2 as they turned 40. Celebrating King Kong and Godzilla, tonight we're talking about the first time that they actually fought on screen, the first fight they ever had. Because some people might not even know that they actually fought before in the past, and actually the 1960s. And you wouldn't have Godzilla if it wasn't for King Kong. And you wouldn't have a new King Kong if it wasn't for Godzilla. These boys need each other, much like Batman and Superman, or peanut butter and jelly, or cocaine and waffles. They just go well together. So, let me tell you tonight how these guys got together as I talk about the 1962 film King Kong vs. Godzilla and the King Kong standalone movie in the Godzilla universe of King Kong Escapes. So, turn your volume up, take a sip of your favorite drink, tell your kids to shut up and let you listen to something you love. And let's enter the world of monsters once again. So, previously on Gravely Amusing, we'll start with where we last left King Kong. Well, he's dead. Okay, moving on. Let's go to where we last left the son of Kong. Well, he did. Okay, so if King Kong's dead, what the heck are we going to do? Well, we're going to reboot. We're going to enter King Kong into this Godzilla universe and give him a reboot. So, if King Kong is going to reboot, is Godzilla going to get a reboot? No, because this is actually the third movie in the Godzilla franchise. And the 38 movies, I believe it is, this is the third movie. And he is buried in ice because at the end of Godzilla Raids Again, the Japanese Air Force or whatnot, they buried him in an avalanche. So let's see how the heck this happened and how this came to be. So going to my notes here. So how this movie came to be. Well, I'll tell you. So King Kong versus Godzilla actually had its roots and idea in an early conception for a new King Kong movie. If you remember the name from our King Kong podcast, Willis O'Brien, he was the animator of the original King Kong and with the stop motion. Well, around 1960, he came up with this idea to do a King Kong meets Frankenstein. Yep, I said that right. King Kong fights Frankenstein. And he would fight this giant Frankenstein monster in actually San Francisco, which would become an important Godzilla city as we enter this monsterverse in 2014. But not quite yet. So Willis O'Brien, the guy that animated King Kong, he took the project and some concept art and like a little screenplay he wrote to RKO, the people that owned King Kong at the time. And during this time, they decided to rename the idea King Kong versus the Ginkgo. And because it was believed that Universal Studios had the rights to the Frankenstein name. So O'Brien was introduced to a producer named John Beck, and he promised to find a studio to make the film because, interesting enough, RKO was now Randy Orton and soon to be the WWE champion. RKO was no longer a production company in 1960. So Beck took the story. That producer John Beck took the story and he hired a guy named George Worthington Yates to write the movie. And the story was slightly altered, and the title was changed to King Kong versus Prometheus, returning the name to that original Frankenstein concept. Now, if you follow this podcast, you know that Frankenstein, the book, is also called Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, and that's what I would name a Frankenstein movie if I were to do it. I would call it the Modern Prometheus because I just think it sounds more badass. But the cost of stop motion animation and the time it takes discouraged these studios from putting this film to production. And Willis O'Brien, he is just so stuck on stop motion. And if you remember in the original King Kong movie, there was so much conflict between the director, I believe his name was Mercer, and the guy that kind of pretty much created King Kong, and O'Brien with how to make this movie. So Beck eventually attracted the interest to the Japanese studio Toho. Toho, the creators of Godzilla. And Toho had long wanted to make a King Kong film. So they purchased the script and they decided to replace Frankenstein with a character they've owned for, well, at this time, about 6 years, Godzilla. Now, Godzilla at this time would actually be on the shelf for roughly about 7 years. Well, actually, at the time he'd been on the shelf for about 5 years. They they went hot into making Godzilla Raise Again after Godzilla, and then the American version, Godzilla, the King of Monsters. But then they kind of put him on the shelf for a little bit, and I can't really understand why. I know that I think that because they were probably working on the American version of Godzilla, because that one doesn't come out till I believe 59. So they were probably not sure on the popularity of Godzilla yet, and because it didn't really like blow up in America yet. So that's what happened. So this was to be one of the big releases for the company to celebrate their 30th anniversary in production, of Toho being 30 years, and John Beck's dealings with O'Brien project to sell to Toho was all done behind O'Brien's back, and O'Brien was never credited for this idea. So O'Brien does find out, and he attempts to sue Beck, but he didn't have the money to do so. So on around November 8th of 1962, he actually ended up dying in his home in LA at the age of 76. So his wife believes that the frustration of trying to make King Kong versus Frankenstein was actually the cause of the death. And that may be so. When men suffer great defeat in their life, it can kind of kill us. So, um, Marion Cooper, I apologize, Marion C. Cooper, not Mercer. I said Mercer earlier. Marion C. Cooper, the producer and co-director of the original 1903 King Kong film, was absolutely opposed to this project. He stated in a letter addressing to his friend Douglas Burnham that how can this Japanese company take my King Kong and pair him with Godzilla? Like, they're going to stoop so low as to put a man in a gorilla suit. And I've spoken up that King Kong has to be stop motion. It can't be just some man in a dang suit. It's going to ruin my character. And I'll let you guys be the judge of that, because he does look pretty gosh darn ridiculous. But in 1963, Marion Cooper would actually file the lawsuit. I guess he had more money than Willis at the time, and he was fighting to actually get the rights for King Kong because he believed that he was the outright owner of King Kong. The lawsuit never happened. It turned out he wasn't a Kong sole owner as he previously believed because RKO probably had more of the rights. It's kind of like Joe and Jerry with Superman. Once they sold their rights as kids, like to DC Comics, that was kind of it. And eventually, people they would try to sue and get the rights eventually, but that's a whole nother story. And you can check that out in the Krypton Report with my boy Tyler. So this movie, it does have some very. This movie's wild. It's crazy. So, some of the themes in this movie. Now, this movie would actually be. Let me go through that stats here for you guys. So, this movie would be directed once again by Ishiro Honda. So, Ishiro Honda directed the first Godzilla movie, the second Godzilla movie, and now this third movie. So, we have the same director doing things. So keep that in mind too. Like Ishiro Honda was kind of like the guy for doing that. So this movie would be released in August 11th, 1962 in Japan. It only has a runtime about 97 minutes, not too bad. The budget for this movie would be $432,000 and it made about $8.7 million. So it made a buttload of money. So let's see something here. So the original Godzilla movie made had a budget of 63 million and it made 2.25 million. And then Godzilla Raids Again made 170 million against a 32 million budget. So King Kong versus Godzilla made a buttload of money, like $8 million in the 60s. That's kind of a big deal. Like that did pretty good. Pretty good. So some of the themes in this movie, because even back then every movie had to have a message. The director Ashiro Honda, who is known for good themes, because remember the original Godzilla had the theme of nuclear destruction and how nuclear testing was ruining Japan. Like the man had some deep thinking, but I think the studios of America and and some Toho minds kind of ruined this movie. So, um, but maybe Shiro Honda's creative mind kind of went to the crap too. I don't know. You be the judge of it. But apparently Shiro Honda wanted the theme of the movie to actually be a satire of the television industry in Japan. And I think he actually made for it to be somewhat of a serious satire because there's parts of this movie where it actually is kind of overly serious, but then you get to the ridiculous parts that kind of actually hurt somewhat of the seriousness. And plus, looking at King Kong doesn't really help. So, in April of 1962, TV networks and just the 60s in general at this time, and we're not going to dwell so deep in the 60s yet, but we will probably in the next season of Gravely Amusing. But I'm just hitting this story, the history of Godzilla and Kong here. So, but in 1962, TV networks and their various sponsors basically started producing outrageous programming and doing publicity stunts to try to grab audience attention. After two elderly viewers reportedly died at home watching a violent wrestling match on TV. So that's interesting. Well, this was in Japan, so Japanese wrestling, which is a bit more hardcore. So these ring wars, though, in Japan between these networks and programming, that followed this event caused widespread debate over how TV is actually going to affect Japanese culture, uh, with someone stating that TV was creating like a nation of 100 million idiots in Japan. So TV wasn't looked very well. So Honda states that people were making big deal out of ratings, but his view of TV shows was they did not take the viewer seriously, that they took the audience for granted. So he decided to show that through his movie. And the reason he showed the monster battle through the prisms of a ratings war was to depict the reality of the times. So this with this movie being about ratings and who's going to watch this battle, I and making fun of TV. I guess I understand his message he's trying to get here, but it was not executed very well. It was not good. so 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 I think he needs to stick with kind of more horror type things. Him going into comedy, I just don't think it would very work. So um so in this movie, Honda addresses this satire and the rings war by having a pharmaceutical company sponsor a TV show and going to streams for the publicity stunt for ratings by capturing King Kong. So all a medicine company would have to do is just produce good medicine. But the company doesn't think that way. They think that they will get ahead of their competitors if they have King Kong to produce their product. So it's just weird. So um some of the special effects in this movie were done by special effects director Bro, and he was working on other projects at this point, in which a new version of a fairy tale script called Princess Kaguya. He was working on that, but he postponed this to work on Godzilla or King Kong versus Godzilla because he was such a huge fan of King Kong. So he said in an early 1960s interview that his movie company produced a very interesting script that combined King Kong Godzilla. So how could I not do that? That script is very special to me. It makes me emotional because it was King Kong that got me interested in working in movies in 1933 in the first place. Early drafts of this script were sent back with notes from the studio asking that the monster antics be as funny as possible. So this is what I'm saying when the studio interferes with the director's vision. So I do firmly believe that even though Ashiro Honda wanted to make a satire, I don't think he wanted it to be as funny and ridiculous as we got. So the studio come in saying, make it funnier, make it funnier, make it funnier. Yuck. This comical approach was embraced by Tushibura, who wanted to appeal to children's sensibilities and broaden the general audience. So this third movie, Godzilla, and Godzilla Raids Again, I mean, Godzilla bites the monster's dang jugular. It's awesome and blood scoring everywhere. So I think they wanted to drift away and make it more kid friendly because this was the first movie. This movie is historical because it's the first time we see King Kong in color, but it's the first time we see Godzilla in color. So as these first three movies are so important to Godzilla's history and 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 legacy, because the first movie, is Gojira. It's the first one. I'm sorry, the first four movies, if you will. And Godzilla Raids Again is the first time he fought a monster, changing the format that it's going to be a monster fight. King Kong versus Godzilla put it in color. It continued the fighting aspect, but it also kind of made it goofier. It went on the goofy side of being kid friendly in Godzilla, and you'll see that kind of more as we enter the 60s and things get really really goofy with Godzilla. but that's kind of what they went here. So the studios like make it more kid friendly, make it, make it more uh funny or whatever. But yeah, so much of the monster battle was filmed to contain a great deal of humor, but the approach was not favored by the people doing the special effects, and they couldn't believe some of the things that Toshiburo asked them to do, such as they wanted King Kong and Godzilla volleyballing a giant boulder back and forth. Give me a freaking break. So the next film of Godzilla was Mothra versus Godzilla, um, and that movie begins to the trend to portray Godzilla and the monsters with more like anthropomorphism as the series progressed to appeal to children also. So this really started the process of appealing to children. And here's our boy, Oshiro Honda. This is how I know that he was not too happy with it, with dumbing it down, because Oshiro Honda was not a fan of dumbing down the monsters. He didn't think that a monster should ever be a comical character, that there shouldn't be so much humor in it. The public is more entertained when King Kong strikes fear into the hearts of little characters. When there's, I don't think King Kong's really a fear guy, but I think Godzilla is, and Ashira Honda is saying that Godzilla is more scary. Like that's what we want to do. So yeah, he definitely had some issues with the studio here. So yeah, so let me see here. They did plan to shoot the film in Sri Lanka, but they abandoned that idea after being forced to pay RKO roughly 220,000 for the rights to King Kong, which forced the company to scale down those production costs. For the bulk of the film was shot in the Japanese island of Izu Oshima. The film's production budget came out to 420,000 because they had to pay to use King Kong. But I think it was worth it because they made a lot of money. So, King Kong was played by an actor in a suit, and he looked atrocious. And the suit actor was Shoichi Hirose. I probably said that wrong. And Haru Nakajima played Godzilla. And they were given free reign by Toshiburo to choreograph their own moves. So there was no choreography in the fights of how to do things. If you remember Godzilla, the guy who was in the original Godzilla suit, and I don't think it's the same guy, he knew martial arts, so some of the martial arts fights were choreographed that way. But these two guys would rehearse for hours and would base their moves basically on professional wrestling. So, and you can see that in their fights. So now, there was some idea to toy with a little bit of stop motion, but they pretty much just threw it out the window. And well, I'm sorry, there was two little sequences of stop motion, but they weren't done by Willis O'Brien. So this is mostly like all in suits. So the new Godzilla suit was designed for this film with some alterations. These were including the removal of Godzilla's tiny ears. They put 3 toes on each foot rather than 4. They enlarged his dorsal fins and tried to make him a little bit bulkier because he was facing King Kong, the man with muscles. And they also built a puppet from the waist up and put a nozzle in it for Godzilla's atomic breath, like they did before. And they the shots in the film where the prop was employed with the puppets, like faraway shots of Godzilla breathing and on his breath on a military base, they actually end up cut. And these cuts can be seen in the Japanese theatrical trailer, but were never in the movie. Now, as far as the King Kong suit, which I kind of hate, the sculptors apparently had a hard time coming up with King Kong suit that appeased Toshibura. The first suit was rejected because it was too fat, had long legs were too long, and it made him look a little too cute. A few other designs were done before Toshibura would approve the final look that was used in the film. And yep. So the King Kong space was based on a Japanese macaque monkey, which is, and I probably said that wrong, macaca. Oh, I can't even say it, but is basically was considered a snow monkey in Japan. So it's based basically off of a different breed than on the the actual like gorilla that King Kong usually is. So they used two separate masks for King Kong. They had two separate pairs of arms were also created. One had extended arms to give Kong like a gorilla-like illusion, and the other one were mostly used for the wrestling scenes with Godzilla. Yeah, yeah. um, in the movie, there is an attack with King Kong with a giant octopus, and they did use 4 live octopuses for this, which is pretty dope. But they were forced to move among the miniature huts by having hot air blown into them. So, yeah, they wouldn't move on their own, so they had to blow hot air at them. And after the filming of the scenes were released, they released the octopuses back into the wild. Um, and they had some octopus puppets because the octopuses were too difficult to work with. And yeah, so this movie also King Kong was seen as a bigger draw, and Godzilla was considered the villain. So they really pushed this down your throats that Godzilla is still considered the villain, unlike in the current movies where Godzilla is kind of considered the hero. King Kong is also considered the hero, but they're kind of working together. This one was a full on like King Kong stop Godzilla type fight. Which they kind of portray in the new movies because you think King Kong is or Godzilla is being bad because he's attacking these plants, but so I guess that worked. So there apparently is 2 versions of this movie. I cannot find the all Japanese version. I have I have a Blu-ray that I believe is I have 2 copies of the Blu-ray actually. One that's just the regular version and or the American version, and then one is the American version, but it's in a box set with the Showa era. So there are different eras in Godzilla, and the Showa era was the first like 15 movies, and it's called Showa because these are different eras in Japan of who was in charge, like who was the emperor or the guy in charge of Japan. Probably not the emperor, but so Showa is just basically who was in charge of Japan. So that's how they base the time. So this is what happens in the movie. Brace yourself because it's not good. So this movie starts off with we basically throughout this movie get the whole movie, like the movie has basically no human connection and there's no real human story. It's just basically weird news reports from a Japanese satellite talking to American news reports from a satellite, and it's almost like in the original Willy Wonka movie, how they give some news bits, but it's not as entertaining. It's not as good. It's a bunch of interviews of like what's going on and talking from the news people. It's just really really weird. So here we go. This is what happens. So Mr. Taco, Tico or whatnot, the head of Pacific Pharmaceuticals, is basically frustrating with the television shows that his pharmaceutical company is sponsoring, and he wants something to boost his ratings. So this other doctor tells Taku about a giant monster he discovered on the small Faroe Island. So in this movie, it's important too that Skull Island is doesn't exist anymore. Godzilla is or King Kong is now on this island called Faro Island. And Tico believes it'd be a brilliant idea to find this monster and use it as for publicity. So Taco sends two men, uh, Asamu Sakurai and Kinsaburo Fure, to find and bring back the monster. In the meantime, American nuclear submarine Seahawk gets caught in an iceberg. That iceberg is where we last left Godzilla, who's been trapped in it since 1955. So he's been in there for 7 years, according to the story. So Godzilla gets out and he destroys that submarine because that's what Godzilla does. And he makes his way towards Japan and he attacks a military base as he journeys southward. On that island, the Faroe Island, or Faroe Island, a giant octopus crawls ashore and attacks the native village in search of this Farolacton juice, taken from a species of red berry native to the island. This berry and juice is going to become an important part of this movie's story. So keep that in mind. So, this mysterious monster that on Faroe Island is actually King Kong, and he arrives and defeats this octopus. So the rivalry between King Kong and a kraken or a giant octopus is featured in just about every King Kong movie, and I think and this is kind of where it continues here. So after he defeats this octopus, King Kong decides to get drunk or get high, whatever you want to say. And he drinks several vases full of this juice from these berries. And the islanders perform a ceremony which causes him to fall asleep. So it's important to note as well in this American version of this movie that there is a whole lot of kind of racist type things a bit. In the original King Kong movie, they got actual African actors. They got actual actors that would kind of depict like an African tribe and stuff. They did it very well. In this in this movie, they take a bunch of Japanese people and they give them blackface. It's not good. Not a fan of it. So yeah, so all these black-faced Japanese people, they do a ceremony and King Kong gets drunk. And so Sakurai and Faru, these two guys from the pharmaceutical company, they somehow place Kong on a raft. So maybe they have some other berry that gives them super strength or a sensu bean. Who knows? And they put Kong on a large raft and they transport him back to Japan. And then this Mr. Taku guy arrives on the ship through a helicopter and drops down. And there's all this comedy of him like almost blowing up King Kong with some dynamite accidentally as he keeps leaning on this pad that has dynamite. It's pretty stupid. It's totally silly. So he arrives where the transport Kong is, but a JSDF ship stops them. Remember the Japanese forces, and they order that Kong must be kept out of Japan. Get them out of there. We don't. They don't. They have enough monsters. Meanwhile, Godzilla arrives in Japan and he terrorizes the countryside. Kong eventually wakes up and breaks free of the raft. He reaches the mainland. Kong faces Godzilla for the first time and throws a bunch of rocks at him. Godzilla's not phased by this rock attack, and he uses his atomic breath and says, "Get out of here." And Kong retreats because he realizes he's not ready to take on Godzilla. He is not ready for that jelly. The JSDF decides to dig a large pit and layer it with explosives and poison gas and lure Godzilla into it. But Godzilla isn't phased by that. So they next decide to string up a barrier power lines. How they get the time to to dig this trench in just a matter of like hours or so or days, I have no idea. I guess, the Department of Transportation works wonders in Japan and they need to come over to the United States because, we're suffering. Our roads suck. But anyway, so they decided to string up a barrier of power lines filled with over 1,000,000 volts of electricity because that works so well in canon in the first movie. and uh, and this somehow it actually proves effective, which is interesting. And Kong approaches Tokyo and he tears through the power lines and he feeds off the electricity, which make him stronger. So this starts the precedent that Kong can channel electricity in his body to make him super powered, which does come in effect in some later Kong movies as things are rebooted. Kong can channel electricity to make him stronger. So keep that in mind. Kong enters Tokyo and he captures Fumiko, which is Sakurai's sister, because you have to have some type of human elements that they barely touch on in this movie because it sucks. And and King Kong grabs a chick like he always does, and takes her to the National Diet Building because they want to go on a diet. And he scales this building. Remember, this is a new Kong, and this is a new universe, but they're still going to have him grab a girl and make that part of his canon that he likes chicks, and he's going to scale buildings. The JSDF decide to launch capsules of that vaporized berry, which makes him drunk, and it puts him to sleep. So Kong is a raging alcoholic in this movie. Or they Bill Cosby him, they give him rupees or whatever. and and the JSDF decides to transport Kong via balloons. How that works, I don't know. In hopes that they will take him to Kong or to Godzilla, and these two monsters will just kill each other. The next morning, Kong is deployed by helicopter right next to Godzilla at the summit of Mount Fuji, because that is where you guys have a battle. And they do have a battle. Godzilla initially has the advantage, though, and he gives King Kong a drop kick and hits him with his tail and gives him the bionic elbow. Godzilla attempts to burn Kong to death by using his atomic breath to set fire to some foliage around his body. But then a bolt of lightning from Thor comes down on Kong, reviving him and charging him up, and the battle kicks into high gear. Godzilla and Kong fight their way down Mount Fuji into Atami, where the two monsters destroy Atami Castle while trading blows before falling off a cliff together into the Sagami Bay. And after a brief underwater battle, only Kong resurfaces from the water and he swims back towards his island. There is no sign of Godzilla after that fall from the cliff. So in this movie, they actually and King and Godzilla's third movie, but King Kong's first movie in this reboot as part of the Toho universe, they actually have Kong win. Something they really didn't do today. Well, yeah, kind of did. Like, kind of made Godzilla be the main guy, but in this first one, Kong comes out the victor. So this movie did very good. That's how the movie ended, by the way. And so this movie did very, very good. Um, it did, over almost a little over $8 million. It was huge. This movie on good old Rotten Tomatoes, boo, Rotten Tomatoes, has approval rating of 52% based on 21 reviews and has average rating of 5.10 out of 10. On Metacritic, the film has a score of 40 out of 100 based on 4 critics, indicating mixed or, average reviews. And that is that movie. And due to the great box office success of this movie, Toho wants to produce a sequel immediately, and they want to bring back. And I don't speak Japanese, so please give me some grace. Shinichi Sekizawa was brought back to write the screenplay, tentatively titled "Continuation," King Kong vs. Godzilla. But Sekizawa reveals that Kong had killed Godzilla during that auto battle in Sagami Bay, with a line of dialogue stating Godzilla, who sank and died in the waters of Atami. And as this script, in this original script, as the story progressed, Godzilla's body is salvaged from the ocean by a group of entrepreneurs who want to display his remains at a resort. And King Kong is found in Africa, where he's protecting a baby, a sole survivor of a plane crash. And after the baby is rescued by investigators and is taken back to Japan, Kong decides to follow them and rampage through the country looking for the infant. Uh, Godzilla is then revived somehow with hopes of driving off Kong. And the story ends with both monsters plummeting into a volcano. That sounds somewhat interesting, I guess. I mean, it further establishes Kong kind of protecting people and being like the real good guy. But that project was canceled. And a couple years later, United Productions of America, or UPA, and Toho decided to once again try to put together a Frankenstein monster idea, but they were going to put Godzilla against the Frankenstein monster, and that was canceled by Toho as well when they decided to match Mothra against Godzilla, because the Mothra movie came out in the early 60s, and do Godzilla versus Mothra instead, which I think was probably the better choice. So during this time, too, as Godzilla King Kong came out, Toho was introduced in producing a series around that version of King Kong that they just created, but they were refused by RKO. Um, Even though RKO didn't exist, I guess I guess whoever had the rights. And Toho would handle the character once more in 1967, 5 years after this movie, with help of Rankin Bass, and they would produce the film King Kong Escapes, which is loosely based on a cartoon series that they have made for King Kong. So how about that? So now I want to talk about the King Kong Escapes movie, because this movie is the last time you see King Kong until they decided to reboot him again in 1975. So, um, when Rankin Bass, if you don't know, Rankin Bass is the company that made Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and they made Frosty the Snowman, and all those childhood stop motion Christmas classics. Well, this was also this movie wasn't really stop motion that they did, but they created an animated series. It wasn't stop motion; it was totally animated. You can't find it anywhere except YouTube. You can find some episodes on YouTube, which I suggest you check out just to kind of check it out. But they made a Kong series. I think it had at least one season. It's hard to find, so I apologize. I don't have a lot of info on it, but it is important to King Kong history. And the in the animated series, it's kind of a retelling of the original 33 film, but it has a tame Kong who has a friend who's a boy, a little boy, and the boy kind of directs Kong to fight for the forces of good. And in this new movie, in this new movie, King Kong escapes. They decide to kind of take this idea that Kong will do these tasks or like it's a force for good, and they add in basically kind of this character called Doctor Who. Even though this movie came out kind of around when Doctor Who came out a few years later, the British Doctor Who show, but they kind of like add in this Bond villain to it, and they try to make this movie is wild. It is a Bond movie meets King Kong. Like there's no better way to describe this movie. I mean, it is wild. And I'm just gonna I'm just gonna get into it. What happens here? Because it's pretty wild. So basically, there's this evil genius named Doctor Who, and he decides to create a Mechanicong or a mecha version of King Kong. And I hope that in Godzilla X Kong that we do see Mecha Kong or Mechanicong. I think that would be pretty dope. But we just saw Mecha Godzilla, so they might want to hold off a little bit. But anyway, or maybe in the movie after this, they bring Mecha Godzilla back, and then Mechanicong. That would be pretty cool. So anyway, this Doctor Who, not to be associated with the British version, the Bond villain, he wants this Mechanicon to dig for this highly radioactive element called Element X. It's just called Element X. We don't know what he wants it for. It's whoever has this element can basically control the world. Okay. And this element's found only at the North Pole. So they have Mechanicon enter this ice cave and begin to dig into a glacier, and the radiation destroys its brain circuits, and they can't control the robot, so the robot shuts down. Doctor Who then sets his sights on getting the real Kong to finish the job, because apparently the real Kong is stronger than a robot, or the real Kong's brain will shut down, something like that. The scientist is taken to like he works for this female scientist that is called Madame Piranha. Yes, it's so cheesy, and her country is financing Doctor Who to get this element, Element X. In the meantime, a submarine commanded by Carl Nelson arrives at Mondo Island. So they, in this continuity of this Toho continuity, they have already changed the name of the island again. So we had Skull Island, which is original continuity, and the current continuity in the new movies. Then we got Faroe Island. Now it's called Mondo Island. So whatever. And in the submarine by Carl Nelson arrives on Mondo Island, where the legendary King Kong lives. And here the giant ape gets into this big fight with this dinosaur, and he fights a sea serpent as well. And he falls in love with the Lieutenant Susan Watson, and follows in the footsteps basically of Andaro in the 1933 film. So yeah, so Doctor Who basically gets to Demondo Island, abducts Kong, brings him back to the base at the North Pole, and hypnotizes Kong by using a flashing light device. And and a radio earpiece. So they hypnotize Kong using Mechanicong, basically. And they command King Kong to retrieve the elephant from the cave. But eventually, there's problems with the earpiece, and uh, Doctor Who discovers that Susan can control Kong, so he decides to kidnap Susan. And after Watson and her fellow officers are captured by Doctor Who, the Piranha Lady unsuccessfully tries to seduce Nelson and bring him over to her side. And eventually, Kong escapes, swims all the way to Japan, where this big battle with Mechanicon transpires. And the two face off at Tokyo Tower, and Kong prevails and destroys Mechanicon and kills Doctor Who and his men, and then Kong swims back home. So, I also want to add in this movie, kind of like the Americanized version of King Kong versus Godzilla, especially in this movie. This movie's weird because, like, instead of the actors just speaking in English and using their normal voices, the English is dubbed over their voices by other actors. It's just weird. It's just weird. I don't get it. Toho, you gotta get your crap together. um, but this movie was distributed by Universal Pictures and Toho. This came out in 1968 in the United States, 1967 in July 22nd, 67 Japan, June 9th, 1968 in the United States. And the box office was it only made like $1 million. I can't find any I can't find what the budget was, but I know it didn't do very well. um it basically has negative reviews, all like New York Times and all this stuff. uh the Japanese, it basically says the Japanese are all thumbs when it comes to making monster movies. Um, the Toho's good at building sets, but they just don't know what they're doing anymore. Based on what he says, they made it too goofy. No one liked it. So after this movie, Toho did want to use King Kong again, and King Kong was actually included in an early draft for the 1968 film Destroy All Monsters, but was dropped due to the license expiring for working with Toho. So basically, they just had to bring in other monsters for Godzilla, and they tried many times in the 90s and also the 70s to get Godzilla back against King Kong, but it didn't work out until Warner Brothers got the rights to King Kong, basically in like 2014, around that time, like 2017, around that time. So that's what happened in that movie. And make sure I don't miss anything here. And yeah, yeah. So there, yeah. So after this, King Kong kind of goes into fighting Mothra and starts getting very more iconic monsters to fight. In the 50s, Godzilla, or a movie was made called Rodan, and they pull Rodan into the Godzilla universe. So King Kong was kind of the start of making these other monsters in these other studios, and then pulling them into the Godzilla universe and fights with Godzilla. So we get King Kong first, and then we get we get Mothra and her own movie, and then they pull her in, and then we get Rodan brought into the universe after that, and well, that's a story for another season. But this is, this is where it started. And as you can tell, it didn't really start too great. um well, I mean, it was very successful financially, but story wise it wasn't too good. But you can find King Kong versus Godzilla. It's not streaming anywhere, but you can easily find the DVD and Blu-ray for cheap, for under like $10 off Amazon or Walmart. I recommend you check it out and have it in your collection, because it is movie history. It's the first color battle of Godzilla, and first color of King Kong, and the first time they're fighting together. So I recommend you check that out. And tune in later this week as we go into the story of the Monsterverse and the current updated story of King Kong and Godzilla, because that is going to be something special. Steve Duray and I are going to go through the timeline of what happens in the Monsterverse, and how it's all put together, and how the timeline is going through Monarch show, Godzilla, King Kong Skull Island, and all that. So I hope this brief podcast kind of helps you know how they started together, and what came of it, as the rights would go back to to kind of RKO, and then Paramount for a little bit in the 70s with King Kong. The rights just kind of went all over the place, and Godzilla kind of goes all over the place too. So I hope this episode kind of helped you out and gets you prepared for the movie coming out. I know that the timeline of the Monsterverse will help you a little bit more as we recap events that have happened. So if you like this show and you like Gravely Musing, or you want to know more horror history, this season we're going to delve in a lot of movies of the 50s, and we're going to delve into the history of Bigfoot and the history of Loch Ness Monster. And it's going to be a very cool season. And after the month of March, we are going to take a break, though, for a little bit, because I will be going on vacation with my wife. We need it desperately. And I will be gone for a few weeks, and then I'll be focusing on my other podcast, which focuses on a superhero history and nostalgia. That's simply just called Bryan the Guys. I'm Bryan. I got a bunch of guys. We talk about nostalgia topics, and we have a lot of fun there. We'll be delving deeply into the X-Men movies and X-Men '97, and preparing for Deadpool and Wolverine, and we're going to have a lot of fun there. So if you like this podcast and you want more of Gravely Musing, or to check out Bryan the Guys, you can find me at Gravely Musing on X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. And you can find Bryan the Guys on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you want to find me personally and just give me a shout out, you can find me on X, TikTok, Threads, and Instagram as the Man Child of Steel. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. I hope you had a little bit of fun. I hope you learned something. And thank you so much, listeners. I hope this podcast thrilled you. I hope it shocked you. And if nothing else, I hope it left you gravely amused.